Namaste, everyone. Our today's speaker, Padma Bhushan Ved Nanda, is Distinguished University Professor at the University of Denver, where he founded the International Legal Studies program in 1972, and now directs the Ved Nanda Center for International and Comparative Law. He served as Vice Provost at the University of Denver from 1994 to 2008. He is an honorary professor at the University of Delhi, India, and has received honorary doctorates of law from Shoka University, Tokyo, Japan, and Budalkan University, Jhansi, India. He has taught and lectured at numerous universities in US and abroad. Professor Nanda has authored, co-authored, or edited 25 books and more than 250 chapters and law review articles on various aspects of international law and international organizations. Professor Ved Nanda serves as the chairman of the board of Hindu University of America. He is widely published and he has also received a number of awards, including the Gandhi King Ikeda Award for Community Peace Building. Mananiya Ved Nandaji is the Sanghachalak for Hindu Swayamsevak Sangh for North America region. At this time, I would like to invite Mananiya Professor Nandaji to the podium. Namaste.
I think this podium is good. Everybody is on the podium. So, my Sadar Namaskar to everyone. And I'm delighted, honored, privileged that all of you are here. And I'm grateful to you. This topic, and along with that, Hindutva, these two issues are the ones that in the last many years, we have had critics after us so that we need to explain, we need to at times justify. And Hindutva is primarily for those who are outside India and obviously inside Bharat too. But because it's the diaspora that has got to deal with being a Hindu and Hinduism and Hindutva. And in Bharat, nationalism and Hindu nationalism, especially for BJP, becomes a paramount issue. And today what I intend to do is share some thoughts with you. And I hope that you will, although I just heard that you have to just write simply questions, but those who are here today, and if the organizers of the program feel it's okay, then some of them might want to share their own thoughts. We have here Manya Sumitra Gokhale ji, Vinod ji, and so many of you that I have great admiration for. And I would like very much to hear from you any comments that you have. What I intend to do today is to talk about nationalism, then good and bad nationalism, and then where do we as Hindus and talking about Hindu nationalism fit in. Let me begin with a critique of nationalism recently put forward by a pretty well-known author, and let me read it. Nationalism as a political movement is very distinct from patriotism. The post-1990 nationalists in Yugoslavia did not love their country. They set out to destroy it. Serb, Croat, Bosnian, Slovenian nationalists tore apart Yugoslavia. And look at what next comes. Hindu nationalists seem determined to destroy the tolerant, multicultural India set up in 1947. Hungarian nationalists feel closer to ethnic Hungarians in Romania than to Roma in their own country. The same is true of Han nationalists in China. In the 1930s, German nationalists felt no solidarity with German Jews. And then the author continues, coming to Russian in between other nationalists. And then he says, I'm not interested in dictionary definitions of nationalism. Actual existing nationalism is not patriotism. Rather, it is, and let me read to you, there are 7 specific identities, items that she mentioned. Fake history, which glorifies the past and denies a country's past crimes. Bigotry against minority groups, and in many cases, misogyny. Protectionism, opposition to immigrants, authoritarianism, militarism, intolerance of alternative lifestyles. And then it goes on. And I'll stop here. But since talked about patriotism and nationalism, let me also mention to you how the critiques are there. Nationalism, it says, creates an you, us versus them mentality, a sense of superiority, supremacy, and pride leading to prejudice. Critics have mentioned the notion of nationalism as narrow, as archaic, as intolerant, as racist, as zealous, as irrational, uncompromising, and a hindrance to the creation of a pluralist democratic society. Now, the distinction between patriotism and nationalism. Patriotism is the love of one's country. One can define it as civic pride in shared culture and democratic institutions. It's not a creed. It's not a political philosophy. It's not an ideology. It's just a feeling, which is a thing of the heart, not a thing of the head. The feeling is, for example, that your country is winning in Olympics. You feel proud. Your country's people are losing. You feel sad. That is the kind of feeling that patriotism brings. And then what it says is, nationalism can be seen as a creed, or at least as a political philosophy or an ideology. It's not a feeling, not an emotional impulse. It's a thing of the head, not the heart. Later on, I'm going to talk about Christian nationalism also. And here I might briefly mention, you have heard it often, it's the notion that America is a nation by and for Christians only. That Christian identity, American identity, they are closely related. And that Christian nationalists seek to preserve and enhance that union. I have not read, I have not seen that document, but there is a document, Biblical Basis for War. I've heard about it, I've seen about it, and I'll discuss Christian nationalism after I do a review of nationalism and good and bad nationalism. I usually kind of ramble a lot, and I decided today not to do a whole lot, but to look at what others have said and not paraphrase them. And my own thoughts I'll share anyway. First of all, there is little consensus on what nationalism is, what the origin of nationalism is, what the origin of nations is. And there are modernists who would say that a few centuries back, with the 17th century, when a nation state came into being, that nationalism grew. And then those who are pre-modernists, and believe in that. They feel that nations and nationalism has been long for a long part of it. And no consensus on the precise relationship between nationalism and nation either. Because nations, some say, predate nationalism, but are transformed by it. And for others, nationalism creates nations. And for others yet, nations are the modern transformation of pre-national communities. But anyway, nationalism is the object at the present time of a sustained criticism. And there are plenty of ways that they have talked about nationalism. They talk about belief not simply in your country's inherent greatness, but that your country sits at the top of a hierarchy of power and greatness. And nationalists just doesn't love their country. They see the world as a power struggle between nations, and that they believe that their nation should win that power struggle at any cost. Nationalism is seen as a bad thing, and because it leads to discrimination, it leads to prejudice, and patriotism is positive because it represents love of nation without the sense of superiority that nationalists have. And here examples would be xenophobia, intolerance, isolationism, expansionist military crusades, enacting anti-immigrant policies. And I won't go into details, but this one talks about nationalism examples, and I won't go into any details about it. Believing in your own culture's superiority, but not simply superiority, but intolerance about others. Patriotic leaders will explain their love for their country without trying to construct a dualism between their own culture and other ostensibly inferior cultures across foreign shores. Second, jingoism, aggressive foreign policy. Third, xenophobia, fear of foreigners. Four, anti-immigrant policies. Five, assimilationism, an attempt of a dominant culture to absorb a minority culture into its own. This often occurs when ethno-nationalism is the official policy of a government. Then there is plenty written about economic nationalism, sectarianism, fascism, ethnocentrism, chauvinism. And since we have talked often now in the last 5 minutes, 10 minutes about patriotism and nationalism, here I would simply mention to you that one person who did use that nationalism and to the extreme, and in a way that you would consider to be distortion of it, was Trump, who started talking about Make America Great Again, MAGA, his mantra of America First. And he tapped the power of nationalism, I think, more effectively than anyone else, and distorted it because he started saying no immigrants and many other problems just based upon all that. If I have to look at nationalism again, I think I would probably mention to you, let me mention a few more things that people talk about nationalism. I mentioned all that intolerant and other things, but there are plenty other adjectives that they have used about nationalism. Let me start then talking about how conservatives in this country have looked at all this debate and discussion. And I'll start with the imaginative conservative. This is a journal that is sponsored by the Free Enterprise Institute. And these are conservatives who feel in this country that they are in the mainstream, and they are the ones who feel that today in this world, there is nobody, especially in this country, who has a right to have its own views propounded than conservatives. It says, and I'll read it, nationalism has a bad name, and for very good reason. Much that is evil has been done in its name, and much other evil has been ascribed to it, justly or otherwise. Due to its bad name, it is customary to distinguish between patriotism and nationalism. The former is seen to be good, whereas the latter is seen as something that patriots need to avoid. Nationalism is considered a disordered distortion of patriotism, a disorientation which points the patriot in the wrong direction. And as you can probably guess, they want to look at nationalism in pretty bad light. Vinodji and I talked about this issue at one time, and I simply said that nationalism here in this country and in the West is seen through their own prism. And what that simply means is that they have had their experience, not simply Nazi Germany, where all those Holocaust and other atrocities against Romas and others were done. But along with that, today you can see in Hungary, in Poland, fences, immigrants, totally unacceptable. And today you probably have seen that in many instances, that because of these migrants moving, that in a country such as Italy or Greece, where they have been inundated at times because of these immigrants, they have now started taking action and legal action against those who try to rescue those people from rickety boats and from drowning in the Mediterranean. And if they try to save them, and then those are the people that they are trying at the present time to have legal action taken against them. And there have been instances in Greece and in Italy also. What they have done is that they have stopped these people who are trying to rescue, and they go after them. But in all these countries, Austria, even Poland, Hungary today, you find that it is totally exclusive, nothing inclusive. They are the not only superior, but they've got supremacy. And it's a zero-sum game. And that is where I was talking with Vinodji and others, that today you have in this entire field of, especially talking about nationalism, the kind of thinking that they have. I was also looking at, although they said I don't want to see the dictionary, I looked at the dictionary of Webster, Merriam-Webster, and it says loyalty and devotion to a nation, especially a sense of national consciousness. Now, this is good nationalism, loyalty and devotion to a nation, especially a sense of national consciousness. Now comes the bad nationalism, exalting one nation above all others, placing primary emphasis on promotion of its culture and interests at the cost of others, as opposed to others, of other nations or supranational groups. So I think the point simply is inclusion versus exclusion. I'm not going to be here preaching to the choir because how Hindus are and what Hindus have done throughout the ages. Anybody who was persecuted from anywhere came to Bharat. Bharat gave them not simply a place in order to have shelter, in order to start their own life again, but help them. The Maharajas, the Rajas, people who were running small kingdoms in Bharat, they are the ones who had Christians, Jews, Baha'is from Persia, Parsis, and then from Dalai Lama. Today, as you go in Bharat, and those of you who have gone to McLeodganj, and you probably have seen, it's all Buddhist. And they have got the entire area, not simply to them, but they have got all kind of well-being secured, ensured by the government of India. And I think the point simply is that exclusion, that is the hallmark of bad nationalism. Hindus have never practiced it. Hindus have never said exclusion. They have included everybody. And then so I think I won't probably talk a whole lot about it, but let me continue and discuss the nationalism little more in detail. Examples that they have given in history. They start from Napoleonic Wars and post-revolutionary French Republic. And based upon that, French invasion of neighboring countries. Napoleon crowning himself as the emperor in 1804. Later in the 19th century, 1870, belligerent nationalist Prussia led to that nation's invasion of France in the Franco-Prussian War. And as if to rub salt into the wounds, what happened is that Wilhelm King of Prussia, he had crowned himself emperor in Paris. And then I think I don't need to remind you of the British rule over India and Queen Victoria, known as the Empress of India. You can add to it the Nazi Empire of the Third Reich. You can add to it the Soviet Empire and the current Ukrainian war, where the Soviet Union simply has said, Ukraine doesn't exist. It has no separate existence. It is a Soviet Empire. Again, a zero-sum game. And that is where nationalism, bad nationalism comes in. It is the imperial power. What they do is they establish empires, these nationalists. And imperialism, and I would simply say that it's wearing a mask and mask of patriotism. So that is what bad nationalism is. It's a pride that leads to prejudice, and pride that begets bigotry. And that is where this comes down. Let me say a couple words about the Christian nationalism. And if I've got to say that, after having talked with Christians and Christian nationalists also, but having done some research and looking into what Christian nationalists believe, then I think they believe America has to be guided by Christian religious values. The government must privilege Christianity as the moral truth, that it must legislate Christian ideology for the good of everyone. It's a powerful tool. I think you'll have to permit me. I'll probably talk about 5-6 minutes more. I was hoping that I would finish in 20-25 minutes, but it'll probably take about 5 to 10 minutes more, and then I'll conclude. And then I would be happy to take not simply questions, but if it's permissible, even hear from some of you. So Christian nationalism believes America has to be guided by Christian religious values. It's a powerful tool to demonize the critics in extreme terms. They call them as antichrist. They call them as satanic. Those who have studied Christian nationalism, they recognize the real and present danger the ideology of Christian nationalism poses to the safety and security of American democracy. Christian nationalism is the belief that the American national nation is defined by Christianity, that the government must take active steps to keep it that way. Christian nationalists strongly feel and assert that America is and must remain a Christian nation. For example, you have heard a lot about Samuel Huntington, and he also talked about arguing that America is defined by the Anglo-Protestant past, and we must preserve our cultural inheritance, because otherwise we'll lose our cultural identity. The belief is that Christianity should enjoy a privileged position in the public square. Christian nationalists believe American identity is inextricably intertwined with Christian identity, and that they must remain as a union united, and they define America as a Christian nation. Some have advocated for an amendment to the Constitution to recognize America's Christian heritage. Some believe America has a special relationship with God and has been chosen by Him to carry out a special mission on earth. They want immigration restrictions to prevent any change to American culture. They tend to treat other Americans as second-class citizens. Some are even arguing that Christians prepare to fight physically to preserve America's identity. I spoke about biblical call for war. Certainly an argument that played into the January 6th insurrection. Some go to the extent of saying that America is a nation by and for Christians alone. And as you appreciate the US Constitution, because many of you know about it, this idea threatens the principle of the separation of church and state. It undermines, those who know about it, the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. Simply says you can't have any religion as an established religion of your own. It leads to discrimination, sometimes violence against religious minorities, and even the non-religious people. I want to read to you what the lead pastor of a Baptist church in New York said. He was at that time in New York, and living very close to where all that January 6 happened, capital. So he said, what was most shameful about January 6, 2021, for me, were the throngs of so-called Christians holding large wooden crosses, signs with Bible verses, who had come to DC that day, believing they were enacting the will of God by resisting the attempt of a corrupt political establishment to prevent Donald Trump, whom many believed was the anointed leader, God anointed leader, from continuing his, quote, righteous reign, unquote. They had been convinced by pastors, politicians, pundits alike that they were engaged in a holy war, biblical proportions, and were commanded by God to fight for Trump. Now, at the foundation of these beliefs was an ideology, and that ideology is Christian nationalism. At its core, it believes a particular nation is to be guided by Christian religious values, that the government, to be right before God, must privilege Christianity as the moral truth, legislate Christian ideology for the good of everyone. I think I'll leave it there. It goes on and keeps talking about it. I need to mention very briefly Amanda Tyler, who is the executive director of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. And what she has said, and what other people along with her have said, that today conflicts most often arise from Christian nationalism. That at its core, this idea threatens the principle of the separation of church, and I mentioned all that to you. But what she is saying is, single biggest threat to religious freedom in the United States and to democracy today is Christian nationalism. It's antithetical to the constitutional ideal that belonging in American society is not predicated on what faith one practices or whether someone is religious at all. Political ideology that seeks to merge American and Christian identity is deeply embedded in American society, manifests itself in a number of different ways. And she keeps on talking about it. But let me briefly, simply conclude by saying about her, Christian nationalism is a political ideology, a political cultural framework that seeks to merge American and Christian identities. And I mentioned that, but she continues about it, talks about white supremacy, talks about authoritarianism, talks about patriarchy, talks about militarism. And she says, I have not simply been talking about it as something that's not concrete. I have seen it, I have noticed it, I have experienced it with people who believe in it. And I think I'll conclude by saying to you about the Christian nationality. Pew Research Center did a survey. And as you know, their surveys are pretty rigorously done. They are professional, and their surveys usually are seen as ones that cannot be challenged. And at least they have got a great deal of credibility. It captured many of the groups, and especially talking about Christian nationalists, and found that 45% of Americans, and just to think about this number, 45% of Americans believe America should be a Christian nation. And most of these people are white. They are Fortunately, in politics, almost 81% of them are um, Republicans, and even black Protestants are 67%, 54% of non-evangelical Protestants, even Catholics, 47% fall into that group. The only group that doesn't fall into that kind of number is Hispanic Catholics. They are 36%. And Jews who don't believe in that, and unaffiliated atheists and others. Half of Americans said the federal government should never name any religion as the country's official faith, though. So that is the story. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, there is at the present time still no consensus on what nationalism is, but it has gotten a bad name. And there is that bad nationalism. But I think I need, again, not to dwell on it, but as Hindus in Bharat, being not simply tolerant, much more than being tolerant, but accepting. And as we talk all the time, say it all the time, that tolerance simply means that you consider yourself to be superior and you tolerate others who are inferior to you. So Hindus have accepted differences. Hindus have not only that, but respected those differences. Hindus have celebrated differences. And so at the present time, if I've got to say, it is that through the prism of Western eyes and Western thinking, nationalism has gotten a pretty bad name. And so what needs to be done in India, I think, to convince people that it is a good nationalism is going to take a whole lot of time. And so I think to call oneself as a patriot in India for Hindus is equally good as simply saying that I'm a Hindu nationalist.